The annual St. Luke's summer fete had, for as long as anyone could remember, been the sort of event in which nothing whatsoever happened, and that in St. Mary Mead was precisely its charm. There was sponge cakes that tasted of baking powder and good intentions, raffles of dubious fairness presided over by the vicar's wife, and the inevitable rain shower that sent ladies scurrying under striped canvas tents, making amiable remarks about the English climate. Miss Jane Marple, settled comfortably in a wicker chair near the tea tent, accepted a cup that was more hot water than Darjeeling and surveyed the scene with her usual mild interest. It pleased her, this quiet hum of village life, the murmur of voices, the shrieks of children let off the leash, the clink of crockery. Yes, people were very much like teas, Miss Marple reflected. You could learn a great deal from how they behaved when overheated and diluted. This year, however, there was novelty. The St. Mary Mead Amateur Film Society, formed only last winter under the energetic leadership of Mr. Isaiah. Julian Hargreaves had announced with considerable pride the premiere of its first proper picture, to be shown in the church hall as a special attraction of the fete. There had been posters in the grocer's shop and even most daringly, a notice in the Melchester Gazette. Grand Village Film Show St. Mary Mead Through the Seasons. With special closing sequence, Secrets at Sunset. Entry, 6pence. Proceeds to the church roof fund. Secrets at Sunset, sniffed Mrs. Betts, Bantry, lowering herself onto the chair beside Miss Marple. Sounds more like one of those frightful American pictures with people slinking about in satin. I dare say it is only a little dramatic flourish, dear, replied Miss Marple mildly. Young people like to feel they are doing something important, or... Her eyes travelled, apparently idly, towards the hall. Something rather more interesting than it is. The film show was scheduled for 4 o'clock, and at 5 minutes to the hour, there was already a little crush of villagers at the church hall doors. Miss Marple, declining with quiet firmness Mrs. Bantry's insistence that she must come in, no, dear, dark places and I have never agreed, remained outside where she could watch the comings and goings with a comfortable lack of obligation. The hall swallowed them. Mrs. Price Ridley with an air of moral disapproval mixed with curiosity, young Dr. Leonard with the pretty new schoolmistress, Miss Clara Fielding, Colonel Melchett looking faintly skeptical, Inspector Slack, who having no official business, had nevertheless contrived to be present, Mr. Julian Hargreaves himself darted in and out, a thin, eager man with spectacles that slid perpetually down his nose, clutching tins of 16mm film like a mother with armfuls of, infants. The first reel began with a whirring hum, audible even from the churchyard, where Miss Marple now drifted, ostensibly to admire the roses. Laughter and intermittent applause filtered through the open windows, the village pond in winter, the high street in spring, the vicar attempting to ride a bicycle to universal amusement. 10 minutes later, there came a curious interruption. The hum stopped abruptly. Voices rose, not in panic, merely the vague complaint people feel when entertainment is withheld. After a short interval, the projector started again, though with some sputtering. The sounds from within resumed. It was nearly half an hour later, as Miss Marple discussed earwigs with the sexton's wife, that the screaming began. It was a woman's scream, high and sustained, the sort that is never uttered for anything but reality, not mice nor even husbands. Doors burst open. The crowd spilled out of the hall, faces white, mouths excited, gay, voices clamoring all at once. "He's dead! In the projection room! Blood all over!" Miss Marple, who had risen at the first cry, moved a little closer, small and neat in her faded summer hat. Over the chorus of agitation, one phrase distinguished itself, shrill with horror and a kind of fascinated outrage. "And there's 10 minutes of the film gone. 10 minutes clean missing." For a moment, no one in the parish hall moved. The incongruity of Tommy's words with the faint smell of tea and beeswax polish seemed almost too great to be bridged. Then chairs scraped sharply against the wooden floor as several people stood up at once. Now, Pierce, don't talk nonsense," Colonel Bantry barked, though his ruddy complexion had paled. "Dead. At her age." "I'm not talking nonsense, sir," Tommy insisted, still panting. "She's lying by the old yew, near the north wall. Mrs. Price Ridley sent me. She was coming from Evensong and nearly tripped over her." There was a brief flurry of half-finished questions and exclamations. Mr. Finch let go of the projector, which rattled uneasily, and pressed a handkerchief to his forehead. Miss Marple rose slowly, her knitting carefully folded and placed upon her seat. Her pale blue eyes rested for an instant on Mr. Finch's agitated face, then on the empty space where Mrs. Ashworth had been sitting. "It would be best," she said mildly, "if the police were telephoned at once. Dr. Haydock, I suppose you will wish to see her first." "Quite right, Miss Marple," the doctor replied crisply, regaining his professional manner with visible effort. "Tommy, go to the telephone box outside and ring the station. Colonel, perhaps you and I." "I'll come too," said the vicar, his usual gentleness sharpened by concern. No one ought to be left alone with anything of that sort. As the small group hurried out, the rest of the audience drifted into uneasy knots of conversation. The harvest supper, laid out on trestle tables at the back of the hall, remained tantalizingly untouched. No one felt much like cold ham and pickles. Miss Marple did not join the clusters of whispering villagers. Instead, she moved unobtrusively to the aisle, her light step belying her years, and stood for a moment studying the projector and the abandoned reel of film. Mr. Finch was hovering nearby, twisting his handkerchief. "You are quite sure," she asked gently, "that the film was complete yesterday, Mr. Finch?" "Absolutely, Miss Marple. I went through it carefully. I remember because there was a little scene in the churchyard, children playing among the leaves. Mrs. Ashworth was in that bit, actually, passing by. It was rather charming." A shudder went through him. "Good Lord." "In the churchyard?" repeated Miss Marple thoughtfully. "How very coincidental." The word seemed too strong for her, so she uttered it almost apologetically, as though she were accusing the weather of bad manners. From outside came the faint sound of voices and hurried footsteps on gravel. Presently, Dr. Haydock reappeared at the door, his expression grave. A hush fell over the hall without any need for announcement. "I'm afraid it's quite true," he said. "Mrs. Ashworth is dead. It looks, at first glance, as though she fell and struck her head on one of the stones, but I don't care for the look of it." He hesitated, then added, "And there is indeed a length of film clutched in her right hand. Very tightly. The inspector is on his way." There was a stir, and then the rapid hum of conjecture began in earnest. "Shock, that's what it is," declared Mrs. Price Ridley to a group of eager listeners. "She went out into the cold after sitting in this stuffy hall and took a fainting fit. Poor thing. Of course, widows are always delicate. It tells on the heart. More likely she was frightened," Dolly Bantry countered. "Running off in the middle of the show like that. She saw something on the film, you mark my words. Something she didn't like." "What could she possibly have seen?" the vicar's wife asked helplessly. It was all very ordinary. Miss Marple's fingers moved automatically to smooth a non-existent crease in her skirt. Ordinary, she reflected, had so often proved not at all ordinary upon closer examination. She turned back to Mr. Finch. "You mentioned a scene in the churchyard that is now missing, I think." "Yes. Autumn leaves, the children, Mrs. Ashworth. All gone. Snipped clean out. About 10 minutes in all, I'd say." "Snipped," murmured Miss Marple. "Such a deliberate word, is it not? People rarely snip things by accident." Mr. Finch stared at her, then at the door, where a police car's approach could now be heard as a distant growl. "At any rate," she added calmly, "it seems we have a little mystery involving both film and reality. I have noticed over the years." that people are sometimes more careful what they allow to be seen than what they allow to be true. And with that quiet observation, Miss Marple moved toward by the door with the others, her face mild, her eyes very bright indeed. Word of Mrs. Ashworth's death spread through St. Mary Mead with the astonishing rapidity peculiar to bad news in small villages. By the following morning, every cottage, shop, boys, and back garden had its own version of what had happened in the churchyard, embellished with touches of imagination and personal bias. Some had Mrs. Ashworth tragically fainting in fright, others had her courageously wrestling with a masked intruder. Only the fact of her strangulation and the strip of film in her hand remained constant. Miss Marple, sitting by her cottage window with a pot of tea and a plate of barely touched scones, listened placidly to the latest account from her maid, young Cherry. "They're all saying it, miss," Cherry insisted importantly. "It was that London man, Mr. Latimer. Tommy Pierce says he saw him lurking by the church, just after dark, 2 nights ago. Right shifty, he said." "Indeed?" Miss Marple raised her eyebrows mildly. "Mr. Latimer being the gentleman who rents rooms above the old post office?" "Yes, miss. The one with the camera, always taking pictures of everybody like he's got no shame at all. And he's been in dreadful money trouble. Mrs. Webb at the grocer's says he owes for weeks." "Money trouble," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully, adding a stitch to her knitting. "Such a common ailment, and yet it rarely results in strangulation, except in the more lurid novels, of course. Did Tommy say Mr. Latimer was seen last night?" Cherry faltered. "Well, no, miss, but Mrs. Ashworth had money, didn't she? And he'd know about the film and such. Stands to reason. Things that stand to reason," Miss Marple observed gently, "have a dreadful habit of collapsing when examined closely. Still, it is very interesting that he has both money worries and a fascination with photography." Later that morning, Miss Marple made a slow, apparently aimless circuit of the village. She paused to admire Mrs. Price Ridley's chrysanthemums, to inquire politely after the vicar's rheumatism, and finally eyes to all seen it here at the parish hall. Finch was supervising the removal of chairs with an air of distracted despondency. "Such a terrible business, Miss Marple," he exclaimed as soon as he saw her. "I can't believe it. Murder here in St. Mary Mead, and at our Film Society's first public showing. It will ruin everything." "One must hope not, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing, "though I suppose people might feel a little nervous about being filmed after such a tragedy." He flinched slightly. "We did nothing wrong, Miss Marple, all perfectly innocent village scenes. Nothing anyone could object to." "But then why was part of it cut away?" she asked mildly. "And so very neatly, too." Mr. Finch's fingers tightened around the stack of folding chairs he held. "A stupid prank," he said sharply. "Some silly boy trying to be clever." "Tommy Pierce, perhaps?" Miss Marple suggested, all mildness again. "He does have a talent for finding trouble." Mr. Finch relaxed a fraction. "Tommy is a nuisance, but I don't believe even he would dare. No, if you ask me, it's that Latimer fellow. He offered to improve the film, you know. Talked about editing, as if our simple village work needed it. I refused, of course, but he had access to the equipment for a time. And now, look what's happened." Miss Marple merely nodded, though inwardly she noted how quickly suspicion was being redirected. Mr. Latimer again. The obvious suspect was obligingly presenting himself, as they so often did. As she left the hall, she nearly collided with Inspector Slack, who was striding in with an air of self-importance. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, less brusque than usual. "You'll be pleased to hear we've already got a strong lead. That lodger fellow, Latimer, known to the police in London. Fraud, they say, and he's been hanging round that film society from the start." "How very efficient of you, Inspector," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "I do hope, though, that in your zeal you won't overlook the smaller, more domestic details." Crime, I have often observed, is rarely as romantic as people wish it to be. Slack sniffed. This isn't romance. It's motive and opportunity. And I mean to have a word with him this afternoon. Miss Marple watched him go, her blue eyes thoughtful. Obvious suspects, she reflected, were like two dandelions. They sprang up everywhere, bright and insistent. The truth, more often, lay among the quieter, less noticed growths. Miss Marple did not press Arthur Finch further. Years of experience had taught her that people, when left alone with their fears, often revealed more than if they were aggressively questioned. She made a few sympathetic murmurs about strain and shock, then took her leave with apparent harmlessness, pausing only to admire a bedraggled Michaelmas daisy as though that, and not murder, occupied her mind. As she walked back towards the village, however, her thoughts were anything but tranquil. Arthur Finch's reaction had not been that of a man guilty of murder, she felt, but of someone caught in a different sort of wrongdoing. Guilt, yes, but tinged with shame rather than terror. That distinction, in Miss Marple's mind, was of the utmost importance. She had barely reached her garden gate when Inspector Slack appeared, striding up the lane with his usual air of harassed self-importance. His expression, upon seeing her, suggested he had resigned himself to the inevitable. "Miss Marple," he said shortly, "I was just coming to find you. I'd prefer you didn't go about upsetting my witnesses." "My dear Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly, "I have no wish to upset anyone. I merely went to offer my condolences to poor Mr. Finch. It must be dreadful to have one's innocent hobby mixed up with such horror." Slack sniffed. "Yes, well, he's not my main concern. We've had a report of a suspicious character seen near the village 2 days running, tramp-like fellow skulking about the lanes. Matches what I expected. But there's this business of the film, and Dr. Haydock insists it was taken forcibly from Mrs. Ashworth's hand. Says there are marks where someone tried to pry it loose." "How very determined," Miss Marple murmured, "to risk being interrupted in a churchyard, no less. Such recklessness suggests a person who felt they had everything to lose." Slack glanced at her sharply. "You always think it's someone in the village. Respectable faces and regular churchgoers, that's your style. But this time it's obvious. These things don't happen here." "On the contrary, Inspector," Miss Marple said gently, "these things happen precisely here. Human nature is very much the same in St. Mary Mead as it is in London or anywhere else. The difference is only one of opportunity." He scowled, but said, after a brief hesitation, "Haydock insisted I show you the film strip. Claims you've got an eye for detail. Personally, I think it's a lot of nonsense, but here." He produced from his pocket a small envelope, and with exaggerated caution, tipped out the short strip of celluloid onto Miss Marple's gloved palm. Even without a projector, the tiny images were discernible in the clear autumn light. It was indeed a garden scene. Late roses, a stone path, and 2 figures half visible at the edge of the frame. "That looks like the rectory garden," Miss Marple observed quietly. "The old one, I mean. Those yews are quite distinctive. And the smaller figure, one might almost take it for Mrs. Ashworth herself, from the hat." Slack grunted. "Could be anyone. The faces aren't too clear enough. I had hoped for something more dramatic. A masked man, perhaps." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and bird-like, moved to the second figure, mostly obscured by a trellis. Just a shoulder, a sleeve, a hand resting on the wooden post. The hand, she noticed, wore no ring, but the cuff was fastened with a small, round cufflink, dark against the white. "Most interesting," she murmured. "Not what one sees, but what one does not." Slack frowned. "What are you getting at?" But Miss Marple only smiled and returned the strip carefully. "Merely that gardens are very revealing places, Inspector. People forget themselves in gardens. One overhears the strangest things." As the inspector stomped away, half convinced and half annoyed, Miss Marple stood very still, recalling a different garden long ago. A broken engagement and a gentleman who had removed his wedding ring rather too soon. It was not proof, of course, Not yet. But it suggested that the missing 10 minutes of film might have captured not scenery at all, but a conversation that someone would go to any lengths to erase. The following day dawned cold and clear, the sort of crisp October morning that made every sound in St. Mary Mead seem unnaturally sharp. Miss Marple, who had lain awake for some hours, arranging and rearranging the puzzle in her mind, decided that the time had come to look more closely at the late Mrs. Ashworth's circumstances. Conveniently enough, Inspector Slack appeared at her gate just after breakfast, wearing the harassed expression of a man who half suspected he might be ignoring something important and dreaded discovering what it was. "I've just come from the greenhouse," he announced without preamble, referring to the Ashworth residence. "Thought you might like to know, Miss Marple, that your theory about the murder being connected to that wretched film seems rather far-fetched. No sign of anything unusual among her possessions. Comfortable income, no enemies, nothing to suggest she was mixed up in anything shady." "How very reassuring," Miss Marple murmured, pouring him tea. "And the London solicitor's letters?" Slack's eyes narrowed. "You do hear everything, don't you?" "Yes, there were letters. Turned out to be about an inheritance. Some distant cousin leaving her a tidy sum. All quite proper." Miss Marple stirred her tea delicately. "An inheritance so recent that many people in the village might not yet know of it, Inspector?" He hesitated. "Came through about a month ago, according to the papers." "Why do you ask?" "Because money, like romance, has an unfortunate tendency to complicate human relationships," Miss Marple said mildly, "particularly when it appears unexpectedly." Slack made a dismissive noise, but looked less certain than before. "For the record, Mrs. Ashworth's banking records show small regular deposits before that. Nothing extravagant. Husband died 3 years back. Insurance paid out. That sort of thing." 3 years, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "Long enough to grow accustomed to widowhood, yet not so long that old attachments would be quite extinguished." Slack stood, setting down his cup. "If you hear anything, Miss Marple, and I've no doubt you will, let me know. In the meantime, the vagrant stays in custody. He had scratches on his hands, a history of petty theft, and no alibi. That'll do for me." "As you say, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. Later that afternoon she contrived to meet Leonard Clement again, under the pretext of consulting him about a broken wireless set. Once he had dismantled the harmlessly functioning device on her kitchen table, she steered the conversation back to film. "You mentioned cufflinks yesterday, Miss Marple?" Leonard asked, peering at a coil of wire. "Something about the hand in that frame?" "Merely that the figure, presumably a man, wore a very distinctive round cufflink," she said. "Dark center, silver rim. I thought I had seen something similar in the village." Leonard looked up sharply. "Arthur Finch, he wears a pair just like that on Sundays and special occasions. I've noticed them at committee meetings. Rather proud of them, I think. Presentation gift from the bank when he retired." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but inwardly she made another quiet connection. Arthur Finch's cufflinks, his infatuation with Mrs. Ashworth, his technical skill with film, and his panicked, shame-faced reaction when she had hinted at the missing scenes. All painted a suggestive picture. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that suggestive pictures were sometimes deliberately arranged to mislead. That evening, Mrs. Bantry telephoned with fresh intelligence. "Jane, you'll never guess what I've heard from my maid. She's friendly with the girl who comes in mornings to do for the Finches. Apparently, there have been dreadful rows in that house these last weeks. Shouting, slammed doors, the whole lot. Margaret crying, Arthur apologizing, and it all started about a month ago." "A month ago," Miss Marple repeated, her voice very soft. "How extraordinarily consistent people can be. The inheritance, the arguments, the Film Society's autumn project, all beginning at the same time." After replacing the receiver, she sat for a long while without knitting, an unusual occurrence. A pattern was emerging now. A man who had filmed too much, a wife who had seen what was on the film, a widow newly possessed of money and therefore independent, and somewhere among these three, the motivation for murder. But one question still troubled her. If Arthur Finch, or his wife, had truly wished to destroy compromising evidence, why had a fragment of it remained in Mrs. Ashworth's hand? People who act in haste make mistakes, of course, but this particular mistake felt almost deliberate. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. Someone might very well have wanted the police to see that film strip, just not the whole of it. Margaret Finch seemed to shrink into herself, as if speaking the words aloud would somehow summon the very danger she feared. Miss Marple remained quiet, giving her the space to continue at her own pace. "I wasn't supposed to open the canister," Margaret whispered. "Arthur had told me, boasted really, that he'd made a private cut for his own amusement. He said it was nothing important, just bits that wouldn't interest the village. But when I was in the summer house, knowing Mrs. Ashworth was dead and Arthur was being questioned, well, I had to know what could be so damaging." "You had a projector there?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes." Arthur kept one set up for reviewing his edits. I locked the summer house door, drew the curtains, and threaded the film. It began with what you'd expect. More village scenes, the rectory garden, the churchyard. Then it changed. Margaret shuddered, her hands twisting together. There was a scene from London, a crowded street, then the front of a rather smart building. I don't know where Arthur got it. It certainly wasn't St. Mary Mead. Then the camera zoomed in through a window. You could see inside a room, an office perhaps. And there he was. "He?" Miss Marple prompted very softly. "A man I recognized. I'd seen his photograph once, years ago, in the newspapers. There had been a scandal, fraud, embezzlement, something like that. He was supposed to have disappeared abroad, assumed dead. But there he was on the film, clear as day, and then—" She broke off, pressing a hand to her mouth. "And then?" Miss Marple repeated, still calm, though her mind had leapt ahead. "He wasn't alone," Margaret forced out. "A young woman was with him. At first they were just talking, but then the voices— Arthur must have had some sort of sound attachment— became louder. They were arguing. She threatened to expose him. He grabbed her arm. It was horrible to watch." The scene ended abruptly, but not before— Margaret closed her eyes. "Not before you saw quite enough to know what must have happened to her." Miss Marple sat very still. "And this man, how did Mrs. Ashworth come into it?" "Because she recognized him," Margaret said dully. "She told Arthur so. I overheard them weeks ago in the parish hall. She'd been to London and seen something in a newsreel, footage from years back. She said she was sure the man in it was the same man now living quietly in St. Mary Mead under another name." Miss Marple's needles lay idle in her lap. "So, the missing footage Mr. Finch removed contained this London scene, and Mrs. Ashworth somehow got hold of a piece of it before she died." Margaret nodded. "Arthur only kept a short segment, the most dramatic bit, he called it. He had been experimenting, splicing it with his own footage for some ridiculous artistic project. When Mrs. Ashworth said she recognized the man, he panicked and cut it out. He hid the reel in the summer house, but someone else knew. Someone, Miss Marple murmured, who once wore round dark cufflinks and a dark wool suit, someone whose sleeve and hand appeared in that garden scene where they should not have been. She remembered the tiny detail from the churchyard strip, the unringed hand, the conspicuous cufflink. Before Margaret could respond, there was a sharp rap at the front door, followed by hurried footsteps on the path. Arthur himself appeared at the garden gate, his face ghastly pale. "Margaret," he gasped. "They've just come from the station. That vagrant fellow, Silas Thorne. He's been attacked in his cell. Nearly killed. Inspector Slack says it was an attempted suicide, but Thorne swears someone tried to strangle him in the night." Miss Marple rose at once, her expression tightening. A second strangling, directed at the convenient scapegoat, was no coincidence. It was the desperate act of someone determined to tie off loose ends. "Where is Inspector Slack now?" she asked quietly. "At the station, of course," Arthur replied, bewildered. "He's furious. Says if Thorn dies, it will complicate everything. On the contrary, Miss Marple said, her voice very gentle but her eyes sharp as glass. I rather think it will simplify matters, for those with eyes to see. She turned back to Margaret. I must ask you one final favor, Mrs. Finch. The reel you viewed in the summer house, did you keep it? Margaret hesitated, then slowly reached into the pocket of her cardigan. She withdrew a small flat tin, its metal surface dulled with age. I couldn't quite bring myself to destroy it, she whispered. I thought, if things grew worse, it might be the only proof of the truth. Miss Marple accepted the canister with grave care, understanding that this small, innocuous object had already cost one life and nearly claimed another. Somewhere in its flickering images lay the face of a man who had killed once long ago, and now, to preserve his second identity, had killed again. As she walked away from the Finch cottage, the reel tucked securely in her handbag, Miss Marple knew that the time was drawing near for a more direct test of her suspicions. The murderer believed he had removed every dangerous scrap of film. He could not yet know that the most incriminating images were about to be projected once more. This time not on a parish hall screen, but upon his own conscience. Miss Marple did not have long to wait before events began to move with unexpected speed. Barely an hour after the Finches had left her, a village boy came running breathlessly up the garden path with a message from Inspector Slack. Would Miss Marple be so good as to attend at the police station at her earliest convenience? The phrasing in the inspector's hand was stiff but unmistakably deferential. She arrived to find Slack in a most uncharacteristic state of grim silence. Margaret and Arthur Finch sat together on a hard wooden bench, looking as though they had aged 10 years since that morning. On the desk before Slack lay the metal canister Margaret had surrendered. We've just viewed it, Slack said shortly, as Miss Marple was shown into the small back room where a portable projector had been set up. Thought you'd better see it as well, since you've been involved. The word was not quite complimentary, but neither was it scornful. Progress of a sort. They ran the film again. The jerky black and white images flickered against the makeshift screen. The rectory garden in soft autumn light. The summer house, roses moving faintly in the wind. The camera had been set at a fixed point, covering the stretch of path and the side of the summer house. At first, nothing, then Mrs. Ashworth appeared, crossing the path with purposeful strides, a file or envelope clutched in her hand. She turned sharply toward the off-screen side, her lips moving rapidly. After a few moments, the second figure came partly into view, never fully, always just at the edge. A shoulder, the side of a head, an arm. The person kept carefully to the margin, as though accustomed to avoiding being photographed. The sound was poor, but certain phrases emerged in Mrs. Yanis's, Ashworth's clear, sharp voice. You thought I wouldn't recognize you? Changed the name, but the face? Us Whitechapel Ward, those girls. Forgotten perhaps, but not by everyone. And most chillingly, I have proof now. I'm going to London next week. You can't frighten me any longer. The second figure moved closer for a moment, just enough for the sleeve and hand to be clearly seen. Miss Marple felt rather than heard Margaret's sharp intake of breath. The cuff was neatly pressed, the hand fine-boned and uncalloused, the dark round cufflink a small, unmistakable circle against the white. No wedding ring. Slack froze the frame with a clumsy jab. There, he said triumphantly. That's as clear as it gets. Now, the face isn't enough for a courtroom, but the voice on the soundtrack. We'll have that lifted in London if need be. Miss Marple said nothing. She was looking closely, not merely at the cufflink, but at the cut of the sleeve, the texture of the fabric. Good cloth, but not new. Slight fraying at the seam. And there, just visible when the light caught it, a faint dark thread on the cuff itself. Navy wool. When did you first view this, Arthur? She asked mildly. Finch swallowed. Yesterday morning. I meant to tell the inspector, truly I did. But then we heard about Mrs. Ashworth, and I panicked. I thought, knowing how much I had filmed her, they'd think—" Slack snorted. "They might have, if your wife hadn't had more backbone than you. She's told us the lot. As for our vagrant Thorn, someone tried to finish him off last night. Whoever it was knew their way around that cell block. That's no London drifter's work." Miss Marple's eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. "You have spoken again with Mr. Thorn, I take it?" "Under supervision," Slack said grudgingly. "He sticks to his story. Says he woke to someone's hands on his throat. Didn't see the face. Claims they smelled of— what was it?" He consulted a notebook. "Disinfectant and cigarettes." "Carbolic?" Miss Marple asked softly. Something like that," Slack admitted. "You think that significant, do you?" "It might be," she said. "Particularly combined with Resame, Ashworth's reference to a ward in Whitechapel." Slack frowned. "I'm not following." "No," Miss Marple agreed, almost kindly. "Not yet." On her way out, she nearly collided in the narrow passage with Dr. Haydock, just coming from Thorn's cell. He gave her a rueful smile. "Nasty business," he said. "The fellow's windpipe is tender but intact. Lucky, in a grisly sort of way." Miss Marple's sharp old eyes flicked briefly to his cuffs. Plain, serviceable links today. Square, not round. No fraying, no dark threads. His wedding ring gleamed on his left hand, as she knew it usually did, for he was a man of small but unvarying habits. "You've been at the hospital this morning?" she asked Molly. "Just the surgery here. Why?" He regarded her with professional curiosity. "You're hunting a scent, Miss Marple. I can always tell. Anything I should know?" "Only," she said gently, "that whoever attacked poor Mr. Thorn was becoming quite reckless. That is often when murderers make their most revealing mistakes." She walked back through the village deep in thought. The film had added much, but not everything. The past in Whitechapel, the smell of disinfectant, the careful avoidance of the camera, the knowledge of locks and routines at the station, all narrowed the field considerably. Yet there remained one person whose behavior since the murder had been just a little too correct, a little too helpful. Someone who had, she now realized, both the technical knowledge and the most to lose if an old scandal were brought again into the light. By the time she reached her cottage, Miss Marple had resolved upon her next move. It was time, she decided, to create a very small piece of theater. A situation in which the killer's instinct for self-preservation would be fatally stirred. She would need a willing assistant, an apparently innocent conversation, and one last decisive test of human nature. She reached for the telephone with surprising briskness for one of her years. "Dolly," she said when Mrs. Bantry answered, "could you possibly come to tea tomorrow? And do bring our dear friend from London. Yes, the one with the very official-sounding job. I believe a little talk of Scotland Yard might prove most enlightening." Miss Marple did not go directly home. Instead, she took the narrow path that skirted the green and led to Dr. Haydock's surgery. If one was to suspect a medical man, it was only reasonable to see him in his natural surroundings. Besides, Miss Marple had long ago learned that guilt and innocence often revealed themselves in the smallest of domestic details. The waiting room was empty, save for a faint smell of carbolic and the rustle of papers from the inner office. At her knock, Dr. Haydock's voice called, "Come in," in his usual brisk, rather sardonic tone. He looked up from his desk as she entered, spectacles low on his nose, cigarette smoldering in a tray beside a clutter of medical journals. His sleeves were rolled up, his wrists were bare. "Miss Marple," he said, with a flicker of surprise that turned almost immediately to concern. "You're not feeling under the weather, I hope? This village will never forgive me if something happens to you." "I am in excellent health, thank you," she replied mildly, taking a seat without being asked. "I came about something quite different. Inspector Slack tells me you were good enough to share some of your observations with him, the fibers under poor Mrs. Ashworth's nails, for instance." Haydock shrugged. "Slack's not a fool, whatever people say. Merely impatient. He listens when he's forced to, but yes, I told him those fibers came from someone's coat or scarf. Oh, dark wool. She fought, whoever it was. And you still have the key to the back door of the station? Miss Marple asked, arranging her shawl. He shot her a sharp look. Now that's an odd question. Yes, I still have it. I'll return it when I'm next by. Why? There was an incident with poor Mr. Thorne, Miss Marple said gently. He claims someone tried to strangle him in his cell last night. Good Lord. Haydock leaned back, genuine astonishment in his face. So our murderer is tying up loose ends. I suppose Slack's wondering about my key. He gave a short laugh. Well, he's welcome to. The constable saw me at 10:30, delivering supplies. After that, I was called out to Mrs. Phelps' confinement. Half the village can vouch for my whereabouts. Miss Marple's eyes drifted, apparently aimlessly, a bit about the room. On a small stand near the wash basin lay a pair of cufflinks, plain oblongs of dull metal, utilitarian and entirely without ornament. Haydock saw the direction of her gaze and snorted. Hardly elegant enough for your mystery man, I imagine. Those are for my one decent shirt. I hate them. Miss Marple smiled gently. The person on the film wore round cufflinks, very distinctive, quite dark against the white, and no wedding ring. Haydock exhaled smoke thoughtfully. You know, that description fits rather fewer men than you might think. Half my patients can't be pried out of their signet rings, and they are heirloom cufflinks. Round, you say? Round, Miss Marple repeated. And according to Mr. Thorne, our assailant smelled of disinfectant and cigarettes. You smoke, doctor, but your disinfectant is stronger. Hospital quality. Not what one would encounter at, say, the parish hall. He gave her a shrewd look. You're eliminating me, then? I never eliminate anyone entirely, Miss Marple said serenely. I merely arrange people according to likelihood. It is most useful in gardening and in murder. She rose, and as she did, Dr. Haydock said abruptly, Blackwood. She paused. Dr. Edmund Blackwood. I thought the name rang a bell when I heard it at the station, he said slowly. There was talk in the profession years ago. A young doctor in the East End, brilliant, they said, but wrong somehow. Too fond of experimenting. There were whispers about a scandal with female patients, then a sudden disappearance, just after the first big raids. Officially, he was listed as killed in the Blitz when a wing of the hospital went down. But some of us never believed it. Too convenient. Convenient, Miss Marple repeated softly, for a man who wished to start over. She left the surgery with more questions than answers. If Blackwood had indeed vanished under cover of war, he could have reappeared anywhere, under any name. Some Merrymead was as likely a refuge as any. A quiet village, respectable, forgetful. As she turned into the lane, she nearly collided with Mrs. Bantry, who was hurrying toward her with evident agitation. Jane, you must come at once. There's been a dreadful thing at the parish hall. Smoke pouring out, they say. The projector room. Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered outside the parish hall where smoke still drifted from an open window. The fire had been quickly contained, thanks largely to the vicar and two energetic choir boys, but the damage inside was considerable. The shelves where Mr. Finch stored reels and equipment were blackened, several metal canisters warped by heat. Arthur Finch stood staring at the ruin, his face ashen. Someone did this deliberately, he muttered. The plug was pulled, the fuse bypassed. This was no accident. Inspector Slack, arriving breathless, surveyed the scene grimly. Arson now, is it? Our man's tying off every loose thread he can find. Miss Marple moved quietly through the charred room, her eyes noting what had survived and what had not. Most of the labeled canisters from spring and summer had been pulled down and opened, their film inside melted into useless coils. But on the highest shelf, half forgotten, a single canister remained untouched, its metal only lightly blackened by smoke. It bore, in Finch's neat hand, the label: Harvest Festival, Rehearsal, Vestry Entrance. Septent. She reached up, testing it. The metal was warm but intact. Arthur, seeing her gesture, hurried over. "I meant to destroy everything," he said bitterly, "but I forgot some of the rehearsal reels. That one's probably just people coming and going. Nothing of interest." "On the contrary, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple said softly, cradling the canister as though it were fragile crystal. "I think this may prove to be of very great interest indeed. People coming and going, as you say, can be the most revealing thing in the world." There was another murmur from the doorway. Leonard Clement, the vicar's nephew, had arrived, his eyes alight with a bourgeois mingling of excitement and unease. "I can help project that," he offered, "if the heat hasn't damaged it too badly. I've done restorations for the Film Society." Miss Marple studied his eager face, the slight over-eagerness of a young man too keen to be useful. Then her eyes dropped with practiced casualness to his cuffs. His sleeves, neatly pressed, ended in French cuffs fastened by round dark cufflinks that caught the light as he moved. Inspector Slack listened in tight-lipped silence as Miss Marple laid out her reasoning in the cramped office of the St. Mary Mead Police Station. Dr. Haydock supplied the medical corroboration. Mrs. Price Ridley, bursting with self-importance, provided the account of Miss Hartnell's ghostly recognition of the curate. By the time Miss Marple finished, Slack's ruddy face had paled several shades. He reached into a drawer, produced a dog-eared directory, and jabbed at it with a blunt finger. "Phillips, appointed here 6 months ago. Before that," his eyes skimmed the page. "Interim work in a northern parish. No long-term record, and before the war. No trace. Could be a simple gap in documentation. Could also be a man changing his skin." Dr. Haydock spoke quietly. "If he is Edmund Blackwood, the hospital authorities will remember. Men like that leave scars." Slack snapped the directory shut. "We'll telegraph London, but if he smells trouble, he'll bolt before we get an answer. Or do something worse," Miss Marple added gently. "He has already struck twice. Cornered men with a history of violence do not suddenly become reasonable, Inspector." Slack drummed his fingers on the desk. "You said we need patience, Miss Marple. I don't much like patience when I've got a potential killer preaching sermons on Sundays. What exactly do you suggest?" She folded her hands neatly over her handbag. "You must, of course, continue to appear convinced of Mr. Thorne's guilt. Release no information suggesting doubt. Let Mr. Phillips believe his diversion has succeeded." Her eyes brightened with the faintest glint of mischief. Meanwhile, it might be helpful if an elderly lady with no apparent authority were to talk to him about souls and regret and the danger of secrets. Clergymen rarely resist such conversations. It will be most instructive to see how he reacts. Slack stared. "You mean to go to him? Alone?" "My dear Inspector, I am an old woman who cannot possibly threaten a strong, able-bodied curate. At least that is how he will see it." Her smile was almost apologetic, which is precisely why he may reveal more than he intends. 10 minutes later, Miss Marple was walking up the vicarage path, her steps steady, her mind cool and methodical. The curate was in. The housemaid informed her that Mr. Phillips was working in his study on the Sunday sermon. Miss Marple asked sweetly whether she might have just a little word about the Harvest Festival hymn choices, and was shown in without hesitation. Mr. Phillips rose from his desk at her entrance, his clerical collar perfectly straight, his expression composed. Only the faint tightness around his mouth betrayed strain. On the polished desk beside his open Bible lay a pair of round silver cufflinks with a dark emblem. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm, professionally gentle. "What a pleasure. Please sit. I trust you're bearing up after these disturbances." "One grows accustomed, Mr. Phillips," she replied, settling into the chair opposite him. "Human wickedness is sadly not confined to large cities. Even in villages, the past has a way of following us. He stilled for just a fraction of a second, a tiny pause no one less observant than Miss Marple would have noticed. Then he smiled. "Indeed, yet we must offer forgiveness when the past returns, must we not? That is the Christian way." "Oh, I quite agree about forgiveness," Miss Marple said mildly, "though justice must sometimes come first. I always think of those poor girls in the East End during the war, so many of them trusting, so many taken advantage of. Quite dreadful stories one heard from the hospitals." His hand resting on the desk clenched momentarily. "You've spoken to Mrs. Ashworth about her nursing days, then?" he asked, too casually. "A little. She had an excellent memory for faces, I believe. Recognized people after many years. It can be so awkward when one is trying to live down some unfortunate association from the past." He rose abruptly and went to the window, his back to her. "The past is forgiven in Christ," he said, his tone more clipped. "One must not dwell on it. To do so can be dangerous." "For some," Miss Marple agreed softly, "particularly if there are records, or film, or witnesses still alive." He turned then, and the look he gave her was very different. Sharper, evaluating, a man suddenly aware that the little old woman in front of him might not be as harmless as she, appeared. "Miss Marple," he said slowly, "I wonder, are you here about hymn choices at all?" She smiled, the picture of elderly innocence. "Oh, I think we've gone rather beyond hymns. Don't you, Mr. Phillips?" For the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. Not panic. No, he was too controlled for that. But the cold recognition that someone had finally seen through the carefully constructed facade. It was a look she had witnessed before, in very different faces, at the moment when pretense began to crack. The psychological game had begun, and Miss Marple, with her mild manner and knitting bag by her side, had taken the first decisive move. Dusk fell early over St. Alcour, Mary Mead drawing a soft purple veil over the village as lamps flickered on one by one. The parish hall, ordinarily a place of jumble sales and choir practices, had been transformed into something quietly theatrical. Chairs set in a loose semicircle, the white screen hanging at the far end, and the 16mm projector already set up on its spindly stand. But there would be no film that evening. Inspector Slack, Dr. Haydock, Arthur and Margaret Finch, Miss Hartnell, and the vicar all took their seats with varying degrees of attention and bewilderment. Only Miss Marple appeared perfectly calm, her knitting needles resting neatly in her lap, her eyes clear and thoughtful. Curate Phillips arrived a few minutes late, apologizing with mild clerical charm. "So sorry, urgent parish call," he said, slipping into a chair near the front. His gaze swept the room with professional benevolence, yet Miss Marple noticed how his eyes flickered, just once, toward the darkened projector, and then to Arthur Finch. "Thank you for joining us, Mr. Phillips," Inspector Slack said, his tone unusually formal. "We thought it best to assemble everyone concerned with the film business before proceeding further." Phillips folded his hands, the picture of calm inquiry. "Of course, Inspector. Anything I can do to help." It was Miss Marple who answered. "I think," she said mildly, "that you can do rather a lot." He turned toward her with practiced patience. "Miss Marple, you see," she continued, as though discussing recipes, "we have been trying to understand why 10 minutes of film should be so important that a woman had to die for it. Not merely cut and discarded in panic, but carefully removed by someone with technical knowledge. Someone who understood how film works and how much a camera can see even when one believes oneself safely at the edge of its range." Phillips smiled faintly. "Surely that would be Mr. Finch's area, would it not?" Arthur shifted uncomfortably. Margaret's hand tightened on his sleeve. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Oh no, Mr. Phillips. Mr. Finch is foolish in some ways, but not foolish enough to murder the very subject that so flattered his artistic ambitions." "No." The person who killed Mrs. Ashworth was someone whose entire life depended upon not being recognized. Someone who thought, quite reasonably, that a quiet English village would be the perfect place to bury a past identity. A stillness settled over the room. Phillips did not move, but the skin at the corner of his jaw tightened. Dr. Edmund Blackwood, Miss Marple went on, her tone still conversational, was dismissed from St. Bartholomew's under highly unsavory circumstances. Abuse of vulnerable patients. The hospital hushed it up, of course. Institutions are so good at that, but the nurses remembered. Mrs. Ashworth remembered. And when she came to St. Mary Mead and saw you, Mr. Phillips, she recognized you. A little older, is a new name, a collar instead of a stethoscope, but still the same man. Phillips laughed then, lightly, almost kindly. Really, Miss Marple, this is imaginative. I was in the mission field during the war years. I've told everyone as much. Yes, she agreed. A most convenient fog of hardship and lost records. And yet you wear the cufflinks of St. Bartholomew's class of 1938. You smell of the old disinfectant mixture, carbolic and iodine, which Dr. Haydock tells me has largely been abandoned. You moved through the police station unremarked, because a curate visiting a prisoner causes no comment. And when poor Mr. Thorne described his attacker, he mentioned those two details, the smell and the quick, sure hands. Inspector Slack rose halfway, watching Phillips closely now. Miss Marple's voice softened. When Mrs. Ashworth confronted you in the rectory garden, Arthur's unattended camera caught enough. Your sleeve, your hand, your cufflink. That much you realized. You removed the incriminating section from the main reel, but you did not know she had already taken a short piece for herself. She went to the churchyard with it, intending, I think, to meet someone from London, or at least to gather her courage in a sacred place. She paused, her eyes resting gently on him. You followed her instead. For the first time, Philip's composure cracked. A muscle jerked in his cheek. His eyes slid just briefly to the door, measuring distance. You strangled her there, Miss Marple continued quietly. You have done it before. You know precisely how much pressure to apply, how quickly a body weakens. You left her with the stone of the tomb scraping her hands. Dark fibers from your coat under her fingernails. You thought the scrap of film she clutched worthless without the rest. And then, when the vagrant was arrested, you tried to finish the matter in his cell. All this, he said hoarsely, because of a cufflink and an old nurse's memory. No, Miss Marple said gently, because of a lifetime's pattern. Men like you always choose the same kind of victim. Vulnerable women, poor girls in East End wards, a widow whom no one would quite believe over a charming curate. You misjudged only one thing, Mr. Phillips. He stared at her, breathing hard. And what was that? That villages, Miss Marple replied, remember everything. Inspector Slack stepped forward then, the formal words of arrest sounding strangely small in the quiet hall. As Phillips, Dr. Whodunit. Blackwood realized there was no avenue left, no film to destroy, no witness to silence. Something hard and venomous flickered through his eyes. For a moment, everyone in the parish hall saw him without the collar, without the smile. Then it was gone, replaced by a cold, almost clinical detachment. Very well, he said simply, extending his wrists. It seems, Miss Marple, that St. Mary Mead is less provincial than I supposed. She watched him led away without triumph, only a tired sadness. The missing 10 minutes of film had not merely shown a crime, they had illuminated a lifetime of calculated cruelty that had finally, inevitably, come into the light. In the days that followed Dr. Blackwood's arrest, St. Mary Mead settled into an uneasy imitation of normality. The postmistress resumed her meticulous sorting of letters. The vicar preached on the nature of repentance with a gravity that did not go unnoticed. Price Ridley declared, more loudly than was strictly necessary, that she had never entirely trusted that curate, though in truth she had once praised his diction quite Whodunit. extravagantly. The parish hall, scene of both innocent village entertainments and carefully laid traps, returned to its former use, though Mr. Finch's projector remained conspicuously absent. Arthur Finch had taken it upon himself to dismantle his equipment and pack it away, declaring that his ambitions as an amateur filmmaker had caused quite enough trouble. "You mustn't blame yourself, Arthur," Miss Marple told him gently when she called at the Finch's cottage with a small basket of scones. "Your camera simply did what such things always do. It recorded what was before it, without judgment or malice. It was human beings who chose what to do about what it showed." He looked at her with tired eyes. "If I hadn't been so intent on catching every little moment, none of this would have happened." "Oh, I shouldn't say that," Miss Marple replied mildly. "From what I understand of Dr. Blackwood's past, the reckoning was overdue by many years. If your film had not brought his secret to light, something else would eventually have done so. Evil is very poor at remaining hidden indefinitely, Mr. Finch. It leaves traces." Margaret Finch, who had hovered anxiously in the doorway, spoke up with more courage than she had shown in weeks. "It was my fault as well. I tried to conceal evidence. I thought I was protecting Arthur, but I was really trying to pretend that the truth could be managed if one simply hid the most distressing parts." Miss Marple regarded her with gentle approval. "You realized your mistake in time, my dear, and helped to put things right. That is more than many people ever manage. We must not expect perfection of ourselves, only that, when we see clearly at last, we act accordingly." At the vicarage, life adjusted itself with that curious resilience small communities possess. The vicar's wife fretted over the scandal of having harbored a murderer under their roof, then devoted herself with doubled energy to parish charities, as though good works might scrub away the memory of dark deeds. Miss Hartnell, having narrowly escaped becoming a second victim, spoke rather less confidently about her powers of recollection and listened more attentively when others spoke. Inspector Slack came to see Miss Marple one afternoon, ostensibly to confirm a few final details before submitting his report, though in truth he seemed drawn by a mixture of professional curiosity and reluctant admiration. "I'll say this much," he conceded, accepting a cup of tea with only minimal grumbling. "I'd never have thought to use that film as psychological bait. Had him neatly cornered before he realized the footage didn't show half as much as he feared." "Fear is a remarkably revealing thing, Inspector," Miss Marple observed, her needles moving steadily. "Guilt sees evidence everywhere. An innocent man looks at a blurred image and thinks, 'How indistinct. No one could identify a soul from that.' A guilty one sees the same image and is certain that every detail shouts his name." Slack regarded her with a grudgingly respectful eye. "You saw it from the beginning, didn't you? That this wasn't about robbery or village jealousies, but something that started long before Mrs. Ashworth ever came here." "I suspected once I learned of her nursing past and the inheritance," Miss Marple replied. "Money gives people choices, you know. She chose to pursue justice for something she'd witnessed long ago. It's a dangerous thing, Inspector, when someone who has built a life on buried wrongs encounters a person newly free to speak the truth." When he had gone, the cottage grew quiet again. Miss Marple sat by her window, looking out over the familiar rooftops and gardens of St. Mary Mead. The village looked just as it always had. Smoke rising from chimneys, children darting along the lanes. Miss Bantry's hat appearing and disappearing behind the hedge as she conducted some new garden scheme. Yet beneath the placid surface, Miss Marple knew, lay all the intricate currents of human frailty, fear and vanity, kindness and courage, selfishness and sacrifice. In the end, it had not been forensic science or dramatic revelations that had solved the case, but small, human things. A remembered face, a distinctive cufflink, a nurse's unwillingness to forget the suffering of those no one else cared about. She picked up her knitting again, the pale blue wool forming into a neat, orderly pattern under her practiced hands. Human lives, she reflected, were seldom so tidy. They tangled and knotted and sometimes concealed dark threads among the lighter ones. But with patience and careful attention, One could usually trace how the pattern had come to be. "People are very much like film," she murmured to herself, smiling faintly. "They think they can edit out the parts they dislike. But sooner or later, the missing scenes are noticed." And then, her needles clicked softly in the quiet room. Then someone will insist on asking why. Outside, Saint Mary Mead carried on much as before, the memory of its recent brush with evil already softening into anecdote and cautionary tale. Only Miss Marple, watching from her window, retained the sharp, unflinching awareness that such things were never as far away as people like to believe. But she was content to be underestimated. It was, she had long ago discovered, the most useful position from which to observe the endlessly fascinating mystery of human nature. Winter came early to St. Mary Mead that year, as if the sharpness in the air had been summoned to scour away the lingering unease left by the events of the autumn. Frost traced delicate patterns on cottage windows, smoke curled from chimneys, and the village, with its remarkable talent for self-restoration, began to fold the whole business. Of Mrs. Ashworth and the curate into stories told, in ever more embroidered form, over tea and seed cake. The parish hall returned to its usual functions of jumble sales and scripture meetings, though Mr. Arthur Finch, chastened by the realization of how nearly his hobby had abetted a miscarriage of justice, handled his camera with newfound humility. The Film Society, after a respectful pause, resumed its meetings, but their subjects became resolutely prosaic. Birds on the common, cricket matches, the vicar's dog. No one proposed another year in the life for some time. Margaret Finch, who had once seemed a quiet, slightly faded woman in her husband's shadow, surprised everyone, perhaps herself most of all. It was she who quietly suggested that some of Mrs. Ashworth's remaining funds, once legal matters were settled, might be used not merely for a memorial, but for a small charitable trust in her name to support girls from poor backgrounds pursuing nursing training. It was an idea that found immediate support from Miss Marple, who observed that it was exactly the sort of thing dear Mrs. Ashworth would have appreciated. Something practical rather than a plaque no one reads. Silas Thorne, cleared and marched under the watchful but not unkind eye of Colonel Bantry, settled into his work on the estate. He became, over time, a familiar enough figure that Mrs. Price Ridley was eventually obliged to admit, if only to herself, that one could not always tell a man's character by the state of his boots. Inspector Slack, too, altered in small but telling ways. He still blustered, still harumphed when Miss Marple's name was mentioned at county headquarters, but he listened more than he once had, and when particularly knotty problems arose, he found himself thinking somewhat grudgingly, what would the old lady make of this? Though he would never have put it so poetically, he had learned that evil did not always come with a disreputable face. Sometimes it wore a clerical collar and spoke in careful, educated tones. As for Miss Marple, life at her cottage on the lane resumed its usual rhythm of knitting, garden, and callers. She took tea with Mrs. Bantry, compared notes with Dr. Haydock on human frailty, listened to Cherry's courtship anxieties, and seemed to most eyes as placid and unremarkable as ever. Yet those who knew her well could have told you that, in the quiet evenings by the hearth, she often revisited the case in her mind. Not to bask in her success. Vanity was never one of Miss Marple's faults, but to consider its lessons. She thought of Mrs. Ashworth, whose conscience would not let the past rest, of Dr. Edmund Blackwood, who had built a new identity atop unconfessed crimes, of Miss Hartnell, whose vanity in her memory had, ironically, helped save her life. And she thought, as she often did, of how very little separated the respectable from the wicked, save opportunity and the choices made when no one appeared to be watching. People, Miss Marple reflected, as she carefully turned the heel of a sock, are very much like spliced film. They show you what they wish you to see, and hide the rest. But the joins are always there, if one looks for them. A hesitation, an overreaction, a misplaced fear. little flashes where the past peeps through. She smiled faintly, recalling Blackwood, flinching at the mention of St. Bartholomew's, the way his charm had been just a fraction too polished, his concern just a shade too carefully displayed. She had seen the joins early on. It had only been a matter of waiting for the right light to fall upon them. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour. Somewhere, a child laughed. Somewhere, Mrs. Price Ridley's authoritative tones carried across a frosty hedge. Life went on, as it always did, folding even murder into its steady pattern. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and reached for the teapot. There would be other puzzles, other little tangles of human behavior to smooth and sort and understand. She did not seek them. They came as naturally to St. Mary Mead as spring crocuses and parish quarrels. For now, justice, as much of it as this world could manage, had been done. The missing 10 minutes of film had found their place in the larger reel of human folly and courage, and Miss Marple, content in the knowledge that truth had once again, quietly, stubbornly prevailed, poured herself another cup of tea.